The water was colder than Lieutenant James Harrison had imagined. As the Higgins boat cut through the dark waves of the English Channel on that fateful morning of June 6, 1944, he could feel the spray hitting his face like tiny needles of ice, mixing with the sweat that had already begun to form despite the chill. Around him, 32 men from the 116th Infantry Regiment sat in silence, their faces pale green in the pre-dawn darkness, some praying quietly, others staring blankly at the steel walls that temporarily shielded them from the hell that awaited on Omaha Beach. James was 23 years old, a farmer's son from Nebraska who had never seen the ocean until basic training. Now he was leading these men, boys, really, most of them younger than himself, into what intelligence reports had grimly described as the most heavily defended sector of the Atlantic Wall. His hands trembled as he gripped his M1 Garand rifle, not from fear alone, but from the weight of responsibility that threatened to crush him. These men had families back home, wives, children, mothers who still sent care packages filled with cookies and hand-knitted socks. And he was about to lead them into a meat grinder. The naval bombardment had started an hour earlier, a thunderous symphony of destruction that lit up the horizon like a second sunrise. Battleships and cruisers pounded the German fortifications with everything they had, their shells screaming overhead before detonating against the concrete bunkers that crowned the bluffs. James had watched the display with a mixture of awe and hope, praying that when they hit the beach there would be nothing left but rubble and corpses. But deep down, in that place where honest fears live, he knew better. Before I continue with this story of courage and sacrifice, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we share these important stories of American heroism. Beside James sat Private First Class Michael O'Brien, an Irish kid from Boston who never stopped talking. Even now, with death waiting just beyond the ramp, Michael was whispering to anyone who would listen about the girl he'd left behind, Margaret, with the red hair and green eyes, who worked at the textile mill and had promised to wait for him. He had her photograph wrapped in waterproof paper, tucked inside his helmet. "When this is over," Michael said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the boat's engine, "I'm gonna marry that girl, Lieutenant. Gonna buy a house in Southie, fill it with kids, and never leave American soil again." James forced a smile and nodded, though he couldn't find words to respond. What could he say? That he'd read the casualty estimates, that command expected 70% losses in the first wave? That the odds of Michael ever seeing his Margaret again were slim enough to slip through a crack in the floor? Instead, he checked his watch. 06:20 hours, 10 minutes to H hour. 10 minutes until the ramp dropped and they charged into what veterans from Sicily and Salerno had darkly nicknamed the Meat Factory. The boat lurched suddenly as a wave caught it broadside, and several men groaned as their breakfasts threatened to make a reappearance. Sergeant William Bull Daniels, a career soldier who'd survived North Africa and Italy, moved among them with the calm efficiency of a man who'd seen worse. "Eyes up, boys," he growled, his Kentucky drawl somehow reassuring despite the circumstances. "Remember your training. When that ramp drops, you move. You don't think, you don't hesitate, you move. Get off this boat, get across that beach, and get to the seawall. Speed is life out there." Drill. But as they drew closer to the shore, it became horrifyingly clear that something had gone wrong with the bombardment. Through the grey morning mist, James could see the German fortifications still intact, their dark gun ports staring down at the beach like empty eye sockets. The pillboxes hadn't been destroyed, the bunkers still stood, and somewhere up there, he knew, German soldiers were training their MG-42 machine guns on the approaches, waiting. The young coxswain steering the boat, barely 18, his name was Johnson from somewhere in Ohio, shouted over his shoulder, 30 seconds! His voice cracked on the second word, betraying his terror. James stood, his legs unsteady, and the other men rose with him. They pressed together in the confined space, a mass of green uniforms, white faces, and shaking hands. He could smell their fear, sour and sharp, mixing with the salt air and diesel fumes. "Fix bayonets!" James ordered, though he couldn't imagine they'd get close enough to use them. The metallic click of steel on steel filled the boat as 32 men prepared to transform from human beings into instruments of war. Some made the sign of the cross. Others kissed photographs or lucky charms. Private Tommy Edwards, a kid from Texas who claimed to be 19 but looked 15, was crying silently, tears streaming down his cheeks as he mumbled what sounded like the Lord's Prayer. The boat scraped against the sandbar, still 50 yards from shore, too deep, too far out, but there was no going back. The ramp began to lower with a metallic groan, and in that final moment, before it dropped completely, James locked eyes with Michael O'Brien. The Irish kid's face had transformed. Gone was the jovial storyteller, replaced by something harder, something ancient and terrible. "See you on the beach, Lieutenant," Michael said. Then the ramp hit the water, and hell opened its mouth. The first burst of machine gun fire cut through the men at the front like a scythe through wheat. James saw Private Edwards, the crying Texas boy, literally torn apart, his body jerking violently before he tumbled forward into the water, turning it red. The men behind him tried to surge forward, but the water was chest-deep and the weight of their equipment pulled them down. More machine gun fire raked the ramp. Men screamed. Some tried to climb over the sides of the boat, only to be shot in the air or drown under the weight of 60 pounds of gear. James jumped to the left side of the ramp, plunging into water that immediately filled his boots and dragged at his legs. A bullet snapped past his ear with a sound like an angry hornet. Another hit the water inches from his face. He pushed forward, every instinct screaming at him to dive beneath the surface, to hide, to swim back out to sea. But Bull Daniels was beside him, roaring like his namesake, and somehow James's legs kept moving. The water was a nightmare of churning foam, blood, and floating equipment. Bodies bobbed past him, some clearly dead, others crying out for help he couldn't give. The sound was overwhelming, the crack, crack, crack of rifle fire, the buzzsaw roar of German machine guns, the splash of bullets hitting water, the screams of wounded men. Artillery shells began exploding along the beach, throwing up geysers of sand and shrapnel. 20 yards from shore, James felt rather than saw Michael O'Brien stumble and fall beside him. He reached down, grabbed the Irish kid's collar, and hauled him forward. "Not yet, damn you!" James shouted. "Not yet!" But when he looked down, he saw the water around Michael turning dark and knew he was already gone. The kid's hand reached up, fingers grasping, and James saw the waterproof photograph slip from his helmet and float away on a wave of blood. Margaret, with the red hair and green eyes, lost to the sea. He let go. He had to. The living needed him more than the dead. James hit the beach at a dead run, his lungs burning, and dove behind one of the steel obstacles the Germans had planted in the sand. A Belgian gate, X-shaped metal topped with mines. Bullets sparked off the steel above his head as he pressed himself into the sand, making himself as small as possible. All around him, men were dying. The beach was carpeted with bodies, some still moving, most not. The tide was already bringing in more, corpses floating in with the waves like driftwood. He looked back toward the water and saw another Higgins boat approaching. "No," he whispered. "Go back! For God's sake, go back!" But it kept coming, and when its ramp dropped, the German gunners found it immediately. James watched in horror as every man on that boat was cut down before they could take 3 steps. The coxswain tried to raise the ramp again, but a shell hit the boat directly, and it exploded in a ball of orange flame. "Lieutenant!" Sergeant Daniels had made it to a slight depression in the sand about 10 yards ahead. "We can't stay here. We gotta move." "Move where?" The beach stretched out like a killing field. 200 yards of open sand between them and the seawall. Above that, the bluffs rose steeply, crowned with German bunkers whose guns were methodically traversing back and forth, searching for targets. James forced himself to think. They'd lost over half the men from their boat in the first minute. Maybe 25 scattered survivors were pinned down between the water and the first line of obstacles. If they stayed here, they would die. If they tried to go back, they would die. The only way out was through. He looked to his right and saw a young officer, couldn't have been more than 20, trying to organize a group of men to rush the seawall. The officer stood up, waving his pistol, shouting, "Come on, follow me!" And his head exploded in a pink mist as a sniper's bullet found him. His body collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, and the men he'd been trying to rally pressed themselves deeper into the sand. To his left, James saw a Sherman DD tank, one of the amphibious tanks that were supposed to provide fire support, wallowing in the surf, its flotation screen torn by bullets, water pouring into the hull as the crew desperately tried to bail it out. A moment later, a German 88mm shell struck it squarely, and the tank exploded with a boom that James felt in his chest. This wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. But somewhere in the chaos, something began to change. Small groups of men, survivors from a dozen different units, all mixed together by the randomness of death, started to move. Not in organized waves, but in desperate individual rushes. A man would sprint from one obstacle to the next, dive into cover, wait a moment, then sprint again. Some made it, most didn't, but the ones who made it were getting closer to the seawall. James realized he was one of them before he consciously made the decision to move. His body simply launched itself forward, legs pumping through the sand that grabbed at his boots like quicksand. 5 yards, 10 yards. A burst of machine gun fire kicked up sand in a line that traced his path, but somehow missed. He dove behind a wooden ramp obstacle, gasping for breath, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Sergeant Daniels came tumbling after him a moment later, followed by 3 privates James didn't recognize, survivors from other boats. One of them had been hit in the shoulder, blood soaking through his uniform, but he was still conscious, still fighting. "Navy blew it," the wounded man gasped. "The bombardment, they missed everything. We're on our own." "Then we do it ourselves," James said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. He looked up at the bluffs, calculating angles and distances. The German bunkers were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the beach, but there were blind spots. Had to be. Places where the terrain or the fortifications themselves blocked their line of sight. "See that draw?" He pointed to a narrow ravine that cut through the bluffs about 100 yards to their left. "That's the only way off this beach. We get to the seawall, work our way left to the draw, then push through." "That's suicide, Lieutenant," one of the privates said, a kid with a New York accent whose name tape read Cohen. "Staying here is suicide," James replied. "Moving is suicide." "Hell, breathing is probably suicide, but at least moving gives us a chance to take some of these bastards with us." Bull Daniels laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Damn right, sir. I didn't come all the way across the Atlantic just to die in the sand." He checked his rifle, ejecting a round to make sure it wasn't fouled with wet sand, then slammed it back home. "Who's with us?" The wounded man, his name was Peterson from Minnesota, raised his good hand. "Got nothing better to do." Private Cohen nodded reluctantly. The other 2 privates, younger men whose faces were masks of terror, nodded as well. 6 men. 6 men against bunkers full of Germans armed with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. "On 3, James said. 1, 2, 3. They exploded from cover, running in a ragged line toward the seawall. The Germans saw them immediately, and bullets tore through the air so thickly that James could actually feel them passing, disturbing the air around him like angry wasps. Private Cohen went down, shot through both legs, screaming. Peterson staggered but kept running, leaving a trail of blood in the sand. The two younger privates made it to a burned-out beach obstacle and threw themselves behind it. James and Daniels reached the seawall together, 4 feet of concrete and stone that suddenly felt like the walls of heaven itself. James pressed his back against it, gasping, checking himself for wounds he might not have felt in the adrenaline rush. Nothing. By some miracle, he'd made it across the beach without a scratch. Peterson arrived moments later, his face grey with blood loss, but still carrying his rifle. "Made it," he whispered, almost laughing. "God damn, we made it." They hadn't made it, not really. They'd simply traded one death trap for another. The seawall provided cover from the machine guns on the bluffs, but German mortars were already adjusting their fire, walking shells along the wall, searching for the men who'd taken shelter there. And even if they survived the mortars, they were still pinned down, unable to advance, unable to retreat. James looked along the seawall and saw dozens of other men, maybe 100, maybe more, all pressed against the concrete, all thinking the same thought. What now? Some were treating wounded comrades. Others were simply staring at nothing, their minds broken by the horror they'd witnessed. A few officers and NCOs were trying to organize assaults up the bluffs, but the German fire from above was murderous. Then James saw him, a full colonel, older man, weathered face, stars on his helmet marking him as senior brass. The colonel was walking along the seawall, utterly exposed to the German fire, stopping to talk to clusters of men, pointing up at the bluffs. When he reached James's position, he knelt down and looked the young lieutenant directly in the eyes. "What's your name, son?" the colonel asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Harrison, sir. Lieutenant James Harrison, 116th Infantry." "Well, Lieutenant Harrison, I've got some bad news and some good news. Bad news is we've got about 2,000 men pinned down on this beach, and if we don't get off it in the next hour, the Germans are going to kill every last one of us." The colonel smiled grimly. "Good news is there's only 2 ways we can go, forward or dead. And I don't know about you, but I didn't come all the way from Virginia to die on some goddamn French beach." Despite everything, despite the death, the fear, the absolute horror, James felt himself smile. "No, sir, neither did I." "Then get your men together and follow me," the colonel said. "We're going to take that draw, clear those bunkers, and open this beach. And we're going to do it because we're Americans, and Americans don't quit." He stood up, exposing himself to fire again, and raised his voice so the men nearby could hear. "On your feet. We're moving in 5 minutes. Check your weapons, check your buddies, and get ready to fight." And somehow, God alone knew how, men began to stand. Wounded men, terrified men, men who moments before had been paralyzed with fear, began to check their rifles and fix their bayonets. Bull Daniels caught James's eye and nodded. Peterson, despite his wound, pushed himself to his feet. Even the 2 young privates who'd been cowering behind the beach obstacle came running to join them. James looked back at the water one last time and saw another wave of landing craft approaching through the smoke and fire. More American boys coming to feed the machine. But now, at least, some of them might make it. If he and his men could take that draw, if they could silence those bunkers, if they could transform from victims into fighters. "Ready, Lieutenant?" the colonel asked. James Harrison, farmer's son from Nebraska, 23 years old, looked up at the bluffs where death waited in concrete and steel. He thought of Michael O'Brien and Margaret with the red hair. He thought of Private Edwards from Texas and all the others who died in the water. He thought of home and family and all the reasons men fight and die. "Ready, sir," he said. And with a roar that rose above the gunfire and the explosions, over 100 American soldiers surged up from the seawall and charged toward the German positions, firing as they ran, screaming defiance at death itself. Some fell, many fell, but others kept coming, climbing over their dead and wounded, pressing forward with a fury that would not be denied. This was Omaha Beach. This was D-Day. And this was America, paying the price of freedom in blood and courage. Udin. The climb up the bluff was a nightmare that seemed to stretch into eternity. Every step James took, the sand gave way beneath his boots, sending him sliding backward. German machine gun fire raked across the slope, cutting down men before they could get 10 feet from the seawall. Mortar shells exploded in clusters, throwing bodies into the air like rag dolls. The air was thick with smoke, cordite, and the screams of dying men. But the Americans kept climbing. Daniels was beside James, firing his Browning automatic rifle from the hip as he advanced, laying down covering fire that forced the Germans to keep their heads down. To James's left, the colonel, he'd learned the man's name was Canham, George Canham from West Virginia, was leading a group of Rangers who'd somehow made it across the beach. The Rangers moved with practiced efficiency, using Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps through the wire obstacles, throwing grenades into German foxholes before the defenders could react. James's unit hit a section of enemy trench about halfway up the bluff. 2 German soldiers, boys really, no older than 18 or 19, popped up with rifles. James fired twice. The first German went down, shot through the chest. The second managed to get off a round that whistled past James's ear before Peterson, despite his wounded shoulder, shot him from behind. They tumbled into the trench, and for a moment there was savage close-quarters fighting. More Germans appeared, and the narrow confines of the trench became a killing ground where rifles were too long and bayonets too slow. James found himself grappling with a German sergeant, both of them having lost their weapons. They rolled in the mud, each trying to get hands around the other's throat. The German was older, stronger, more experienced. But James was fighting for something the German couldn't understand. He was fighting for Michael O'Brien and Margaret, for Private Edwards and his mother back in Texas, for every man who died on that beach. He got his hands on a rock, just a rock, but in that moment it was enough. He brought it down once, twice, 3 times, until the German sergeant stopped moving. James rolled off the body gasping, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle when Daniels handed it back to him. "First time?" Daniels asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. James nodded, unable to speak. He'd killed men before, shot them from a distance, but this was different. This was personal. He could still feel the German's breath on his face, see the terror in his eyes as the rock came down. "Gets easier," Daniels lied. "Come on, we keep moving." They fought their way up the trench, clearing it section by section. The Germans fought hard. These weren't the second-rate troops intelligence had promised, but combat veterans from the Eastern Front, hardened by years of brutal warfare. They gave ground slowly, making the Americans pay for every yard with blood and bullets. By the time James's group reached the top of the bluff, the sun was fully up, burning away the morning mist to reveal the full scope of the carnage below. The beach looked like a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay everywhere, in the water, on the sand, piled against the seawall. Burning vehicles sent black smoke into the sky, but more landing craft kept coming, and now that some of the German positions had been silenced, more men were making it across the beach. "We did it," Peterson said, his voice filled with wonder. He was swaying on his feet, pale from blood loss, but still standing. "We actually did it." But there was no time to celebrate. The German bunker that had been commanding the draw was still operational, its guns traversing to engage the new position. James could see the concrete structure about 50 yards ahead, a low, squat fortress with a single firing slit from which an MG-42 protruded. As he watched, the machine gun opened fire on a group of GIs trying to work their way up a communication trench, cutting 3 of them down in seconds. Colonel Canham appeared beside them, his uniform torn and bloody, but his eyes burning with determination. "That bunker's the key," he said. "We take it out, we open the whole drawer. Harrison, you think your men can flank it while I keep them busy from the front?" James looked at his tiny squad. Daniels, Peterson, who could barely stand, and 2 privates whose names he still didn't know, against a fortified bunker full of Germans. Suicide odds. Again. "Yes, sir," he heard himself say. "We can do it," Canham grinned. "Good man. Give me 5 minutes to get into position, then hit them hard. Use grenades if you have them, explosives if you don't. But get that gun." The colonel moved off, gathering men as he went, and James turned to his squad. "Peterson, you stay here. Cover our approach. Daniels, you and the privates come with me. We're going to circle around through that tree line." He pointed to a small copse of shattered trees about 30 yards to the right, "and come at the bunker from the side. With luck, they'll be focused on the colonel's attack and won't see us coming." "And without luck?" one of the privates asked. "Without luck, we die fast instead of slow," James replied. "Questions?" There were none. What questions could there be? They all knew what had to be done. They moved out low and fast, using every scrap of cover the torn landscape provided. German artillery had churned the ground into a moonscape of craters, and they leapfrogged from hole to hole, always expecting to hear the rattle of machine gun fire that would end everything. But the Germans were focused on the beach below and hadn't yet organized a coherent defense of the bluff's top. From the tree line, James had a clear view of the bunker's side. The concrete walls were thick, probably impervious to anything short of a direct hit from naval artillery. But there was a small door at the back where supplies and ammunition could be brought in. That was the weak point. Colonel Canham's attack began right on schedule. James heard the roar of American voices as dozens of men charged the bunker from the front. The MG-42 opened up immediately, its rate of fire so fast it sounded like ripping cloth rather than individual shots. Through the smoke, James could see Canham himself leading the charge, pistol in one hand, waving men forward with the other. "Now!" James shouted, and his squad burst from the trees. They covered the 30 yards to the bunker in seconds that felt like hours. James expected to be shot down at any moment, but the Germans were completely focused on the frontal assault. They reached the back door, solid steel, locked from the inside. Daniels didn't hesitate. He pulled 2 blocks of C4 from his pack, molded them around the door's hinges, attached a fuse, and yanked the igniter. "Fire in the hole!" he roared, and they threw themselves flat. The explosion was deafening, even muffled by the concrete walls. The door didn't blow inward. The hinges were too strong, but it twisted in its frame, leaving a gap wide enough to throw grenades through. The 2 privates pulled pins and lobbed their grenades through the gap in rapid succession. 2 explosions, then screams from inside the bunker. James was through the gap before the smoke cleared, firing his rifle into the darkness. The bunker's interior was a scene from hell. Dead and dying Germans sprawled across the floor, equipment shattered, ammunition cooking off in small explosions. But some of the defenders were still alive, still fighting. James saw a German officer bringing up a pistol and shot him twice. Daniels bayoneted another German who came at them with a combat knife. The fight was brief and brutal. Within 30 seconds, every German in the bunker was dead or dying. The massive MG-42 fell silent. Through the forward firing slit, James could see Colonel Canham's men surging up the draw, no longer pinned down, no longer dying in windows. "Clear!" Daniels shouted, checking the bodies to make sure none were playing dead. James stumbled out of the bunker into the sunlight, his ears ringing, his hands shaking. He'd lost count of how many men he'd killed in the last 5 minutes. 5, 10? Did it matter? They were dead, and he was alive, and the beach was being secured. The rest of D-Day passed in a blur of combat and exhaustion. James's squad, now augmented with survivors from other units, pushed inland, clearing German positions one by one. They fought through hedgerows and farmhouses, through fields and forests, always advancing, always paying the price in blood. By nightfall, they'd moved nearly 2 miles from the beach and linked up with other American units pushing out from Utah Beach to the west. But James found himself in a shell crater with about 20 other men as darkness fell. They'd taken a small village, barely more than a crossroads really, and set up a defensive perimeter. Everyone was exhausted beyond words. Many were wounded. All were covered in dirt, blood, and cordite residue. They looked like ghosts, these young American boys who'd aged a lifetime in a single day. Bull Daniels appeared from the darkness, carrying a case of German beer they'd liberated from a destroyed supply truck. He passed bottles around, and no one objected, even though they were technically not supposed to drink in combat. "To the ones who didn't make it," Daniel said, raising his bottle. "To the ones who didn't make it," they all echoed, and drank in silence. James thought of Michael O'Brien and his Margaret, of Private Edwards from Texas, of the nameless hundreds who died on the beach, in the water, on the bluffs, of the German boys in the bunker who'd probably been as scared as the Americans, who'd probably had sweethearts and mothers waiting for them too. He thought of all of it and wondered how any of them were supposed to live with what they'd done, what they'd seen. "You did good today, Lieutenant," Colonel Canham said, appearing out of the darkness. He'd been wounded at some point. His arm was in a sling, but he was still on his feet, still checking on his men. "Damn good. That bunker you took probably saved 50 lives, maybe more." "We lost over half the regiment on the beach, sir," James replied, his voice hollow. "We did," Canham acknowledged, "and every one of them is a hero. But they didn't die for nothing, son. We're here. We're in France. And tomorrow we push deeper. The day after that, deeper still. And we don't stop until we've driven every Nazi son of a bitch out of Europe and back to Berlin." The colonel put his good hand on James's shoulder. "You think you can do that? Keep leading these men. Keep fighting." James looked around at the exhausted soldiers in the crater, kids from every corner of America, all of them scared, all of them brave. He thought about quitting, about telling the colonel he couldn't do it anymore, that he'd reached his limit. But then he thought about Michael O'Brien, who'd never get to marry his Margaret, about Private Edwards, who'd never see Texas again. They'd given everything. The least he could do was keep going. "Yes, sir," James said. "I can do that." "Good man," Canham said, and moved on to check on the next group of soldiers. James Harrison lay back against the muddy wall of the crater and looked up at the stars, the same stars that were shining over Nebraska, over Boston, over Texas, over all the homes they'd left behind. Somewhere out there, families were going about their lives, unaware that today, on a beach in France, thousands of their sons and brothers and fathers had bought their freedom with blood. He closed his eyes, knowing sleep wouldn't come, knowing the sounds and images of the day would haunt him forever. But he was alive. His men were alive. And tomorrow they would fight again, because that's what Americans did. They didn't quit. They didn't surrender. They paid the price and kept going until the job was done. That was Omaha Beach. That was D-Day. And that was just the beginning of a journey that would take them across Europe, through hell and back, until at last they stood victorious among the ruins of the Third Reich. But that story, the story of what came after, would have to wait for another day. For now, Lieutenant James Harrison and his men simply endured the night, treasured their survival, and mourned their dead. 3 weeks after D-Day, Lieutenant James Harrison found himself in a different kind of hell. The Americans had broken out from the beaches and were pushing inland through the hedgerow country of Normandy. a patchwork of small fields separated by ancient earthen walls topped with thick bushes and trees. The French called them bocage, and they were a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. James's platoon, what remained of it anyway, was dug in along a hedgerow outside the town of St. Lo, preparing for yet another assault. 3 weeks of constant combat had whittled his original unit down from 42 men to 19. They'd received replacements, green kids fresh from England who didn't know enough to keep their heads down, and half of those were already casualties. The faces changed, but the grinding nature of the combat remained constant. Bull Daniels was still with him, seemingly indestructible, though a German mortar fragment had given him a nasty scar across his cheek. Peterson had been evacuated 2 weeks ago when his shoulder wound became infected. James hoped the man had made it back to Minnesota alive. The 2 nameless privates from D-Day had both died in the first week of fighting. Killed by a German sniper, James had later hunted down and shot through a farmhouse window. War had changed James in ways he was only beginning to understand. The nervous young lieutenant from Omaha Beach was gone, replaced by something harder, more efficient, more dangerous. He could read terrain like a book now, spotting good firing positions and likely ambush sites instinctively. He could tell the difference between incoming and outgoing artillery by sound alone. He could look at a man's wound and know if he'd live or die. These were skills nobody wanted, knowledge paid for with too many funerals. "Lieutenant," Sergeant Daniels said, sliding into the foxhole beside him. "Captain wants to see you. Says we're moving up the attack to 1400 hours. James checked his watch. 13:15. 45 minutes. Any particular reason for the rush? Brass says the Germans are pulling back from this sector, moving units to face the British near Caen. Intel thinks if we hit them now, we can break through to the main road, cut off their retreat." Daniels spat into the dirt. Of course, Intel also said Omaha Beach would be lightly defended, so take that for what it's worth. They made their way through the network of trenches and foxholes to the company command post, really just a deeper hole covered with logs and dirt. Captain Miller, a hawk-faced West Pointer from Virginia, was studying a map by candlelight when they arrived. 2 other platoon leaders were already there, Lieutenant Shaw, a quiet Midwesterner from Illinois, and Lieutenant Kowalski, a tough Brooklyn kid who'd earned a Silver Star at Omaha. "Gentlemen," Miller said without preamble, "I'll keep this brief because we don't have time for pretty speeches. Our objective is the crossroads 200 yards ahead, designated Point Fox. Intelligence reports, take that with salt, indicate maybe half a company of Germans holding the position, probably from the 352nd Infantry Division, combat veterans well dug in." He pointed at the map. "Sure, your platoon takes the left flank through this orchard. Kowalski, you're on the right through the farmers' fields. Harrison, you're center, straight up the road. We move in 30 minutes. Artillery prep starts at 13:55, ends at 1400, then we go. Questions?" "Sir," James said, studying the map, "that road's a natural kill zone. They'll have machine guns set up in these buildings here and here, probably mortars pre-registered on the approach. Going straight up the middle is suicide." "Which is why they won't expect it," Miller replied. "They'll be focused on defending the flanks where they expect us to attack. You hit them fast and hard up the center, draw their fire, while Shaw and Kowalski roll them up from the sides. It's a gamble, I know, but if we take that crossroads, we open up the whole sector." James wanted to argue, to point out that gamble was a nice word for sacrifice, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The decision had already been made at levels far above Captain Miller's pay grade. The job wasn't to question orders. It was to carry them out, no matter the cost. "Understood, sir," James said. Back at the platoon position, James gathered his men and explained the plan. He watched their faces as he talked, seeing the knowledge of what was coming settle over them like a shroud. They'd all seen enough combat by now to understand that attacking up a road through the bocage was asking for casualties, but none of them complained. These were veterans now, hardened by 3 weeks of combat that had stripped away any illusions about the glory of war. "I won't lie to you," James said. "This is going to be rough. The Germans have that road covered, and we're going to take hits. But we're also going to take that crossroads because that's what we do. We take objectives, we complete missions, we win battles." He paused, making eye contact with each man. "Stay low, move fast, and don't bunch up. If someone goes down, the medics will get them. You keep moving, got it?" "Yes, sir," they responded in rough unison. At exactly 13:55 hours, American artillery opened up. For 5 minutes, shells screamed overhead and exploded around the German positions. Trees shattered, buildings collapsed, the earth itself seemed to convulse under the bombardment. James used the time to check his rifle one last time, ensuring every round in his magazine was clean and properly seated. He'd learned the hard way that jamming at the wrong moment meant death. The artillery stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. "Go! Go! Go!" James shouted, and his platoon surged out of their foxholes and charged toward the crossroads. The Germans had survived the artillery. They always did, burrowing into cellars and bunkers that American shells couldn't reach. Machine gun fire erupted from a stone farmhouse on the left side of the road, tracer rounds cutting through the air like angry fireflies. 2 of James's men went down in the first burst, one killed instantly, the other screaming as bullets shattered his legs. "Cover left!" James roared, and the men on that side of the formation opened fire on the farmhouse, forcing the German gunners to duck. The platoon kept moving, but the road was a death trap, just as James had predicted. More machine gun fire came from a hedgerow on the right. A mortar shell exploded in the middle of the road, throwing 3 men into the air. But they didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying where you stood, so they ran forward through the fire, accepting casualties as the price of movement. James saw Private Collins, a kid from Ohio who'd been writing a letter to his sister just that morning, get shot through the throat. The boy stumbled, clutching his neck, blood pumping between his fingers, and fell without a sound. James kept running, firing his rifle from the hip at muzzle flashes, not really aiming, just putting rounds down range to keep the Germans' heads down. 50 yards to the crossroads, 40 yards, the German fire intensified. They knew what the Americans were trying to do and were throwing everything they had at stopping them. Then Lieutenant Shaw's platoon hit the German left flank, and suddenly the defenders had problems from 2 directions. James could hear the distinctive crack of American M1 Garands mixing with the harsher reports of German Kar-98s as Shaw's men fought their way through the orchard. The machine gun fire from the farmhouse shifted to engage this new threat. "Now!" James shouted. "Grenades on the farmhouse, then through the door." Bull Daniels and 3 other men pulled grenades, yanked the pins, and hurled them through the farmhouse windows. The explosions blew out what remained of the glass and silenced the machine gun. James was through the door before the smoke cleared, rifle raised, ready to shoot anything that moved. The interior was a charnel house. The German machine gun crew, 4 men, had been killed by the grenades, their bodies torn apart by shrapnel. But more Germans were in the back rooms, and they came boiling out with rifles and submachine guns. The farmhouse became a scene of savage close-quarters combat as American and German soldiers fought room to room, sometimes hand to hand, in the smoke and darkness. James shot a German soldier coming down the stairs, then bayoneted another who charged him with a trenching tool. Daniels kicked open a door and sprayed the room beyond with his bar, killing 3 Germans who'd been setting up a firing position. Grenades exploded upstairs, bringing down part of the ceiling in a shower of plaster and broken wood. And then it was over. The farmhouse was clear. Dead Germans lay sprawled throughout the building, and James's men were already setting up defensive positions at the windows. Outside, he could see Lieutenant Kowalski's platoon emerging from the fields on the right, having cleared the hedgerow where the other machine gun had been positioned. Crossroads secured. Captain Miller's voice crackled over the radio. All units, consolidate and prepare for counterattack. Harrison, you hold that farmhouse. It's the key to the position. James acknowledged the order and organized his men into a defensive perimeter. They'd taken the objective, but at a cost. He'd started the attack with 19 men and now had 12 effectives, 7 casualties in less than 10 minutes of fighting. The math of attrition was brutal and unforgiving. As his men caught their breath and redistributed ammunition from the dead, James climbed to the farmhouse's second floor and looked out over the crossroads. He could see the bodies scattered along the road they'd just charged up, American boys in green uniforms, lying where they'd fallen, some moving weakly, most not. Medics were already working their way forward, doing what they could, but James knew from experience that some wounds couldn't be treated. Some boys were beyond help. He thought about Nebraska, about the farm where he'd grown up, about how simple life had been when the biggest worry was whether it would rain enough for the corn to come in good. That life seemed like it belonged to a different person now, someone young and innocent who died on Omaha Beach along with Michael O'Brien and all the others. Lieutenant, one of his men, Private Hendricks from Georgia, was pointing down the road. Movement! Looks like infantry, maybe 100 yards out. James raised his binoculars and felt his stomach clench. German infantry, at least 2 platoons worth, advancing in good order toward the crossroads. And behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of a tank, probably a Panzer IV, given the size and shape of the turret. "Get on the radio," James ordered. "Tell Captain Miller we've got Germans counterattacking in force. Estimate 50 infantry plus armor. We need AT support now." But even as Hendricks made the call, James knew help wouldn't arrive in time. American anti-tank guns were somewhere back in the hedgerows, probably stuck in traffic or dealing with their own problems. His men had bazookas, shoulder-fired rocket launchers that could kill a tank if you got close enough and were brave enough or crazy enough to stand up under fire and take the shot. "Daniels!" James called down the stairs. "We've got a tank coming. Get the bazookas ready." Everyone else, prepare to engage infantry at 100 yards. Wait for my command. Germans advanced cautiously, using proper fire and maneuver tactics, clearly professionals who'd done this before. The tank rumbled along behind them, its turret traversing slowly, searching for targets. James knew they had maybe one chance. Let the Germans get close, hit them with everything at once, try to take out the tank before it could demolish the farmhouse with its main gun. 50 yards. 40 yards. James could see individual German faces now, young men not much different from his own soldiers, all of them scared and trying not to show it. The tank's turret stopped moving, centering on the farmhouse. "Now!" James screamed. "Fire! Fire everything!" The farmhouse erupted with gunfire. Rifle bullets and bar rounds scythed into the German infantry, dropping men like wheat before a harvester. The Germans went to ground, returning fire, and suddenly the air was thick with bullets flying both directions. Windows shattered, walls splintered. One of James's men took a round through the shoulder and collapsed, screaming. The tank fired. The shell hit the farmhouse's corner, blowing out a section of wall and killing 2 Americans who'd been fighting from that position. The entire building shook, and for a moment James thought the whole structure would collapse. But it held, and Sergeant Daniels was already moving, bazooka on his shoulder, working his way to a window with a clear shot at the tank. "Cover him!" James ordered, and his men poured fire at the German infantry, trying to keep them from targeting Daniels. The sergeant knelt at the window, aimed carefully at the tank's side armor where it was thinnest, and fired. The rocket streaked out in a trail of smoke and fire, hitting the tank just below the turret. The shaped charge penetrated the armor, and the tank shuddered, smoke pouring from the hatches. But it wasn't dead. The turret began to rotate toward the window where Daniels had fired, and James knew what was coming. Daniels, move! Move! Now! The sergeant dove away from the window, just as the tank's machine gun opened up, raking the position he'd occupied seconds before. Daniels rolled, came up with his bar, and sprayed the tank's vision ports, trying to blind the crew. Another bazooka team, Privates Rodriguez and Chen, moved to a different window and fired. Their rocket missed, sailing over the tank and exploding harmlessly in a field beyond. The tank's main gun fired again, this time hitting the farmhouse dead center. The explosion blew in part of the roof and started a fire. James's men kept fighting even as smoke filled the rooms and flames licked at the wooden beams. Rodriguez loaded another rocket while Chen aimed. They fired. The rocket hit the tank's front glacis and deflected, doing no damage. The Germans' infantry saw their chance and rushed forward, trying to close the distance while the Americans were distracted by the tank. James shot 3 of them himself, working his rifle's trigger as fast as he could pull it, empty shell casings flying. Beside him, Private Hendricks was firing methodically, each shot carefully aimed, each shot a kill. The Georgian had been a hunter before the war and had brought those skills to France with terrible efficiency. Then Lieutenant Kowalski's platoon hit the Germans from the side, catching them in the open, in a crossfire between 2 American positions. The German attack crumbled. Men fell or threw up their hands in surrender. The tank, isolated and damaged, began backing up, trying to escape before the American bazookas could finish it. "Don't let that bastard get away!" James shouted. Daniels and his loader scrambled to get a shot, but the tank was moving fast now, disappearing behind a hedgerow before they could fire. As quickly as it had begun, the fight was over. German bodies lay scattered across the crossroads, maybe 20 dead, another 10 wounded or surrendering. The survivors were retreating back toward their own lines, dragging casualties with them. The farmhouse was a smoking ruin, half its roof gone, walls pocked with bullet holes, but it was still standing, and James's men were still holding it. "Casualties?" James called out, already dreading the answer. 4 dead. 6 wounded, Daniels reported grimly. "We're down to 8 effectives, Lieutenant. 8 men. James had started the day with 19 and now had 8 left standing." The mathematics of infantry combat were cruel and precise. Keep fighting at this rate, and in another week his entire platoon would be gone, replaced by new men who would die just as quickly. But they'd held. That was what mattered. They'd taken the objective, survived the counterattack, and held the position. American forces could now push through the crossroads, exploiting the breakthrough, moving one step closer to St. Lo, then to Paris, then to Germany itself. Captain Miller arrived an hour later with reinforcements and medical supplies. He surveyed the carnage around the crossroads and shook his head. "Hell of a fight, Harrison. Hell of a fight. You and your men did good work here today." "We lost 11 men, sir," James replied, his voice flat. "I'm not sure that counts as good work." Miller looked at him with something like sympathy. "In this war, Lieutenant, keeping any of them alive counts as good work. You took an objective against superior defensive positions, held it against a determined counterattack, and kept your platoon combat effective. That's all any officer can do." He paused. "You're a good leader, Harrison. Your men trust you, and they fight for you. That's worth more than all the tactics and strategy in the world." James wanted to argue, to say that leadership didn't mean much to the 11 men who died today, but he was too tired. Too tired and too numb and too full of images that would never leave him. Private Collins clutching his throat, the German soldier he'd bayoneted in the farmhouse, the tank shell blowing his men to pieces. "Thank you, sir," he said, "because that's what you said to superior officers, even when their praise felt hollow." That night, James sat with Daniels and the survivors of his platoon in a shell hole behind the crossroads. They'd been pulled off the line for a few hours, given hot food and a chance to rest. Nobody talked much. They were all lost in their own thoughts, their own memories of the day's fighting. "My sister writes to me," Private Hendrick said suddenly, his Georgia drawl thick in the darkness. "Every week, regular as clockwork, tells me about what's happening back home, who's getting married, who had a baby, all that small-town gossip." He laughed bitterly. "I don't know what to write back anymore. Can't tell her the truth, that'd kill her. Can't lie and say everything's fine because she'd know, so mostly I just don't write. And she probably thinks I don't care." "She knows you care," Daniel said. "Trust me, son. Everyone back home knows we care. They know we're over here doing what needs doing, paying the price so they don't have to. That's enough." "Is it?" James asked. "Is it really enough? We've lost hundreds of men, thousands maybe, and we're still just fighting over some crossroads in the middle of nowhere. When does it end, Bull? When do we get to go home?" Daniels was quiet for a long moment. "When we've done the job we came to do. When every Nazi is dead or surrendered. When every concentration camp is liberated. When Europe is free again. That's when we go home, Lieutenant. Not before." He looked at James in the darkness. "You know I'm right. You know that's why we're here." And James did know. Despite the death, despite the horror, despite everything, he knew. They were here because someone had to stand against evil. Someone had to fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. Someone had to be willing to pay the price, no matter how high it climbed. That was the burden of America. That was the weight these young men carried on their shoulders as they fought their way across Europe, one bloody crossroads at a time. And tomorrow they would attack again. More men would die. More objectives would be taken and held and fought over. The grinding mathematics of attrition would continue, inexorable as fate. But tonight, Lieutenant James Harrison and his 8 remaining men simply sat together in the darkness, bound by shared trauma and shared purpose, and waited for dawn to come. August 1944 found Lieutenant James Harrison and the remnants of his platoon fighting through the hedgerows southeast of St. Lo. The breakthrough had finally come. Operation Cobra, they called it, and American forces were pouring through gaps in the German lines, racing toward Paris and beyond. But even in retreat, the Germans fought with desperate ferocity, making the Americans pay for every mile of French soil with blood and steel. James had been promoted to first lieutenant after the fight at the crossroads, though the promotion felt hollow when so many of the men who'd earned it with him were dead. His original platoon from D-Day was gone, completely gone. He'd received replacements 3 times now, fresh-faced kids from England who didn't know enough to keep their heads down, and they died almost as fast as they arrived. Only Bull Daniels remained from the original group, seemingly unkillable, though he now carried wounds from 3 separate engagements and walked with a pronounced limp. They were attacking a small village, couldn't have had more than 50 houses before the war, though German artillery and American bombs had reduced it to rubble. Intel said a company of Wehrmacht troops were using the ruins as a delaying position, trying to buy time for the main German forces to escape the Falaise pocket that was rapidly closing around them. James crouched behind the stone wall of a destroyed barn, studying the village through his binoculars. The Germans had set up machine gun nests in at least 3 locations he could identify, probably more hidden in the rubble. Mortar teams were positioned somewhere behind the village. He'd seen their shells falling on American positions for the past hour, walking fire back and forth across the approach routes. Beside him, Captain Miller, now Major Miller, promoted after leading the battalion through 6 weeks of continuous combat, pointed at a church steeple that still stood despite the destruction around it. Sniper, probably, maybe an observation post for their mortars. "That's going to be your first objective, Harrison. Take your platoon, clear that church, then push east through the village. Lieutenant Patterson will be on your right, Lieutenant Kowalski on your left. We move in 10 minutes. Yes, sir, James said, though his mind was already racing through the tactical problems. The church was at least 200 yards away across open ground, with multiple German firing positions covering the approach. Getting there meant casualties. Taking it meant more casualties, but that's what they did now. They took objectives and counted bodies afterward. He briefed his platoon, 32 men now, after receiving replacements yesterday. A third of them had been in combat before. The rest were green, straight from training camps in England or even the States. James could always tell the new ones by their eyes, still bright, still believing in things like glory and heroism. The veterans had different eyes, harder eyes, eyes that had seen too much death. Listen up, James said, gathering them close. We're taking that church, then pushing through the village. It's going to be hot. Germans are dug in and they're not planning to leave without a fight. Stay with your squad leaders, keep your intervals, and for God's sake don't bunch up. If someone goes down, the medics will handle it. Your job is to keep moving forward. Questions? A new replacement, Private Williams from Tennessee, raised his hand. Sir, what about the sniper in the church? What about him? James replied. Well, how do we deal with him? Bull Daniels laughed, a harsh sound. We kill him, kid. Same way we deal with all of them, with bullets and grenades and pure American stubbornness. You'll learn. The artillery barrage started right on schedule. American guns pounding the village with high explosive and white phosphorus shells. For 5 minutes, the world disappeared into fire and smoke. Then silence. The sudden quiet after sustained bombardment always felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Move out, James ordered, and his platoon surged forward. They'd crossed maybe 50 yards when the German machine guns opened up. Tracer rounds cut through the air, and men started falling. James saw Private Williams, the kid who'd asked about the sniper, get shot through the chest. He went down hard, blood pumping from the wound, his eyes wide with surprise and terror. A medic ran to him, but James could tell from the amount of blood that the kid wouldn't make it. "Keep moving!" James roared, fighting his own instinct to take cover. "Don't stop! Forward!" They ran through fire that seemed solid, like they were pushing through a wall of bullets. More men fell. A mortar shell exploded to James's left, throwing 3 soldiers into the air like rag dolls. But the survivors kept going, driven by momentum and training and the knowledge that stopping meant death. A bullet snapped past James's ear so close he felt the heat of its passage. Another kicked up dirt at his feet. He was firing his carbine from the hip now. He'd switched from the Garand to the lighter weapon after St. Lo, putting rounds down range without really aiming, just trying to keep the Germans' heads down. They reached the church, or what remained of it. The front wall had been blown away by artillery, exposing the interior like a dollhouse. German soldiers were inside, firing from behind overturned pews and rubble. James threw a grenade through a window, heard the explosion, then dove through the opening with Bull Daniels right behind him. The interior was chaos. Wounded Germans were screaming, others were still fighting. James shot one who came at him with a bayonet, then another who was trying to bring a Panzerfaust to bear on the Americans pushing through the door. Daniels' bar chattered, cutting down 3 Germans who'd been manning a machine gun position behind the altar. And then James heard it, the distinctive crack of a sniper rifle from above. One of his men, Sergeant Brown, collapsed with a hole through his head. The sniper was in the bell tower, exactly where Intel had predicted. "Cover the stairs!" James ordered, and 3 of his men took positions to prevent any Germans from escaping from above. Then he started climbing, the narrow stone steps that spiraled up into darkness. Each step could hide an enemy. Each corner could be his last. But Sergeant Brown was dead, and more men would die if that sniper kept shooting. The stairs were narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and James had to climb with his carbine held awkwardly in one hand. His boots scraped against stone worn smooth by centuries of worshippers who'd never imagined their church would become a battlefield. Behind him, he could hear Bull Daniels following, breathing hard from his wounds and exhaustion. Halfway up, James saw movement above, a shadow shifting in the dim light filtering through gaps in the damaged roof. He fired twice, the carbine's report deafening in the confined space. The shadow jerked and fell, tumbling down the stairs past him. A German soldier, young, maybe 17, shot through the chest. The boy's eyes were still open as he rolled past, already dead. James kept climbing. 2 more turns, and he emerged into the bell tower, an open platform surrounded by a low stone wall. The sniper was there, an older man with iron-grey hair, trying to work the bolt on his rifle with hands that were shaking from the wound in his side. One of James's shots from the stairs had found its mark. The German looked up as James stepped onto the platform, and for a moment their eyes met. The sniper was old enough to be James's father, with deep lines around his eyes and a wedding ring on his left hand. Somewhere, this man had a wife, maybe children. A life before the war had turned him into a killer perched in a church tower. The German's hand moved toward his rifle, and James shot him 3 times. The sniper fell backward against the wall and slid down, leaving a trail of blood on the ancient stone. James walked to the edge of the tower and looked out over the village. American troops were pushing through the streets below, fighting house to house. He could see Lieutenant Kowalski's platoon on the left flank, using a Sherman tank to blast German positions. To the right, Patterson's men were clearing buildings with grenades and gunfire. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, and bodies, American and German both, lay scattered in the rubble. "Clear!" Daniels called from behind him, having checked to ensure no more Germans were hiding in the tower. James looked down at the dead sniper and felt nothing. That was perhaps the most disturbing part, not the killing itself, but the absence of feeling. He'd shot a man at point-blank range, watched him die, and felt no remorse, no horror, no guilt. Just a cold calculation that the sniper was dead, and therefore couldn't kill any more Americans. When had he become this person? When had death become so routine that he could take a life as easily as breathing? The fight for the village lasted another 3 hours. The Germans fell back grudgingly, making the Americans pay for every street, every building. By the time Major Miller called a halt and ordered consolidation, James's platoon was down to 21 men from the 32 who'd started the attack. 11 casualties in 3 hours. The mathematics of infantry combat continued their brutal calculus. That evening, as his men dug foxholes and set up defensive positions on the village's eastern edge, James sat on a chunk of rubble that had once been someone's home and tried to write a letter to his parents back in Nebraska. He'd been putting it off for weeks, not knowing what to say, but his mother had written saying his father was ill and she needed to hear from him. "Dear Mom and Dad," he wrote. "I'm sorry it's been so long since my last letter. We've been moving fast and there hasn't been much time for writing." He stopped, staring at the words. How could he possibly explain what the last 3 months had been like? How could he describe Omaha Beach, the hedgerows, the endless fighting, the faces of the dead that haunted his dreams? How could he tell them that their son, the boy who'd grown up helping with the harvest and going to church on Sundays, had become someone who killed without hesitation, who'd lost count of how many men he'd shot? "Things are going well here," he continued writing. "We're advancing every day, and everyone says the war will be over by Christmas. I'm fine. Don't worry about me. The men in my platoon are good soldiers, and we look out for each other." Lies, comfortable lies that would let his parents sleep at night, that would protect them from the truth of what their son had become. But what else could he do? Tell them the truth? Destroy their illusions about their boy being a hero. Share with them the nightmares that woke him screaming every time he managed to fall asleep. Dad, I hope you're feeling better. Take care of yourself and don't work too hard on the farm. Mom, thank you for the care package. The cookies were great, and I shared them with the guys in my platoon. They all send their thanks. More lies. The care package had arrived weeks ago, and he'd been too numb to enjoy the cookies. He'd given them all away to the replacements, the new kids who still had enough humanity left to appreciate home baking. I miss you both. I miss home. I miss everything about Nebraska. The wide skies, the wheat fields, the quiet. When this is over, I'm coming home, and I'm never leaving again. That's a promise. That part, at least, was true. If he survived and the odds got worse every day, he was going home and never looking back. Let someone else save the world. He'd paid his dues in blood and death. Love, Jimmy. He folded the letter and tucked it away to mail when the supply trucks came through. Then he lay back on the rubble and stared up at the darkening sky, watching clouds drift past in shapes that looked like nothing at all. Bull Daniels settled in beside him, wincing as his wounded leg protested. The sergeant lit a cigarette, German tobacco looted from a dead soldier, and took a long drag. "You ever think about what happens after?" he asked. "After what?" "After the war. After we've done all this killing and dying and we go home. What happens then?" Daniels exhaled smoke slowly. "I mean, how do we just go back to normal? How do we sit down to Sunday dinner with our families and pretend we're the same people who left?" James had been thinking about that a lot lately. "I don't know, Bull. I honestly don't know. My wife—" Daniels paused, his voice rough. "I haven't told you about her, have I? Mary, prettiest girl in Lexington, Kentucky. Married her right before shipping out. 3 days. That's all we had together before I left." He took another drag on the cigarette. "She writes to me every week, tells me about the house she's fixing up for when I come home, about the life we're going to have. Kids, a dog, Sunday barbecues, all that normal stuff." "That sounds nice," James said. "It does, doesn't it?" Daniels laughed bitterly. "Except I don't know how to be that person anymore. The man she married was some Kentucky farm boy who'd never been farther than Louisville. The man who's going home." He trailed off, shaking his head. "The man who's going home has killed more people than he can count, who's watched his friends die, who's seen things that wake him up screaming. How do I fit that person into Mary's nice little house with the white picket fence?" James had no answer. The question was too big, too complicated, too honest. "You think we're heroes?" Daniels asked suddenly. "That's what they call us back home. Heroes. Saving Europe. Fighting for freedom. All that propaganda stuff, but I don't feel like a hero, Lieutenant. I feel like—" He paused, searching for words. "I feel like a man who's done terrible things for reasons that made sense at the time, but get hazier every day." "We're fighting Nazis," James said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. "Evil. We're stopping evil." "Are we?" Daniels looked at him in the fading light. "I mean, yeah, the Nazis are bad, no question. The things we've heard about the camps, the way they treat people, that's evil, pure and simple. But does fighting evil make us good? Or does it just make us necessary?" James didn't answer, because he'd been wrestling with the same questions for weeks now. The simple moral certainty that had sustained him through D-Day and the early fighting had eroded, worn away by too much death, too much killing. He still believed they were fighting for something important, freedom, democracy, all those noble concepts, but the reality of war was so much messier than the propaganda suggested. "I killed a kid today," James said quietly. "In the church tower. Couldn't have been more than 17. Shot him and watched him fall, and I didn't feel anything. That scares me, Bull. Not the killing, the not feeling." Daniels nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like like we've had to turn off part of ourselves just to survive. The part that feels, that cares, that remembers we're human beings and not just killing machines. He flicked the cigarette butt away. Question is, can we turn it back on when this is over? Or is it gone forever? They sat in silence as full darkness fell, 2 soldiers among thousands, all of them carrying the same weight, asking the same questions, wondering if they'd ever be whole again. The night brought German artillery, harassing fire, nothing concentrated, just enough to remind them that the enemy was still out there, still fighting. James and Daniels retreated to the cellar of the destroyed house they'd claimed as a command post. A dozen other men were already there, trying to sleep despite the occasional shell that exploded somewhere nearby. James lay on the cold stone floor, his carbine beside him, and closed his eyes. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of Omaha Beach, of Michael O'Brien sinking beneath the bloody water, of the German sniper in the church tower sliding down the wall. He woke several times, disoriented, not sure where he was or what was real. Around 0300 hours, Major Miller appeared with new orders. "We move out at first light," he said, his voice tired. "Intelligence says the German 7th Army is trying to escape the pocket at Falaise. We're going to help close the trap. It's going to be a hard push, probably another week of fighting before we break them completely." Another week. James did the math in his head. At current casualty rates, another week meant losing maybe half his platoon, maybe more. By the time they closed the Falaise pocket, he might be commanding 5 men, or 3, or none. But what choice did they have? The job wasn't done. The Nazis weren't defeated. Europe wasn't free. So they would keep fighting, keep dying, keep pushing forward until either the Germans surrendered or there were no Americans left standing to fight. "Yes, sir," James said. "We'll be ready." And they would be, because that's what they did. That's what America did. They set impossible objectives and paid impossible prices, and somehow, through sheer bloody-minded determination, they got the job done. At dawn, Lieutenant James Harrison and his 21 surviving men formed up with the rest of the battalion and marched east, toward Falaise, toward more fighting, toward whatever fate awaited them in the ruins of France. Behind them, the village they'd taken at such cost was already being used as a supply depot. Trucks rolled through the streets where men had died just hours before. The dead had been collected and tagged and sent to temporary graves. The wounded had been evacuated. It was as if the battle had never happened. But James knew better. The battle had happened. Every battle happened, leaving invisible scars on the men who fought them, scars that would never fully heal. He thought of his letter home, with its comfortable lies about everything being fine. He thought of Bull Daniels and his wife Mary waiting in Kentucky. He thought of all the men who died on Omaha Beach and in the hedgerows and in anonymous French villages whose names he couldn't even pronounce. And he marched on, because that's what soldiers did. They marched on until they couldn't march anymore, carrying their wounds and their guilt and their determination to finish what they'd started, no matter the cost. September 1944 brought Lieutenant James Harrison and his platoon to the German border. They'd fought their way across France through some of the most intense combat of the war. The Falaise pocket, where thousands of Germans had been trapped and destroyed. The liberation of Paris, which James had glimpsed only from a distance as his unit bypassed the city. The rapid advance through the French countryside as the German army crumbled and retreated. But now, standing on the western bank of the Moselle River, with Germany visible across the water, the war had changed character again. The Germans weren't running anymore. They were defending their homeland, and they fought with a desperation that made the hedgerow battles look tame by comparison. James's platoon had been reduced to 14 men, 6 originals and 8 replacements who'd managed to survive longer than most. Bull Daniels was still there, now carrying wounds from 5 separate engagements, but refusing evacuation. The sergeant had become something more than a soldier. He was a talisman, proof that survival was possible, that some men could endure the crucible and emerge alive on the other side. They were preparing for a river crossing, one of the most dangerous operations in infantry warfare. The Germans held the far bank in strength, with machine guns and artillery pre-sighted on likely crossing points. Intelligence estimated 70% casualties for the first wave. James had heard that estimate before, at Omaha Beach, and knew from experience that intelligence was often optimistic. Major Miller, now Lieutenant Colonel Miller, promoted after Falaise, gathered his company commanders and platoon leaders in a ruined farmhouse to brief the operation. James stood with a dozen other officers, all of them looking older than their years, all of them carrying the weight of too many dead men on their shoulders. "Gentlemen," Miller began, spreading a map across a battered table, "tomorrow morning at 500 hours we cross the Moselle. The 2nd Battalion will provide covering fire from this bank while we assault in assault boats. Our objective is the town of Metz, approximately 2 miles beyond the river. Once we secure the far bank, engineers will throw bridges across and armor will join us for the push into Germany proper." He made it sound simple, almost routine, but James could read between the lines. The Moselle was over 100 yards wide at the crossing point, too far for effective covering fire. The assault boats were plywood and canvas, offering no protection against bullets. The Germans would see them coming and unleash hell. Men would die by the dozens before they even reached the far bank. "Questions?" Miller asked. Lieutenant Kowalski, one of the few original officers still alive, spoke up. "Sir, what about air support? Can we get fighters to strafe the German positions before we cross?" "Weather's not cooperating," Miller replied. "Low clouds, rain forecast. Air Corps says they can't guarantee anything." Of course they couldn't. When had anything ever been easy or simple? "Sir," James heard himself say, "we're looking at heavy casualties on this one. My platoon's down to 14 men. Most of the others are in similar shape. We need replacements before we go in." Miller's face hardened. "You think I don't know that, Harrison? You think I like sending understrength units into combat? We're all understrength. The entire division is running at 60%. But replacements are stuck in the supply chain somewhere between here and England, and we can't wait for them. The Germans are using this time to fortify their positions. Every day we delay, they get stronger." He paused, his voice softening slightly. "I know what I'm asking. I know the cost. But we don't have a choice." There was never a choice. That's what James had learned over 4 months of combat. You followed orders, you did impossible things, and you counted bodies afterward. That was the reality of infantry warfare. The meeting broke up, and James walked back to his platoon's position through the rain that had started falling. His men were huddled in foxholes and under tarps, trying to stay dry and warm, knowing that tomorrow they would be asked to charge across a river into German guns. They looked up as he approached, and he could see the questions in their eyes. How bad? How many of us will die? Will I survive? He had no answers, just orders. "Listen up," James said, gathering them close. "Tomorrow morning, 0500 hours, we cross the Moselle. It's going to be hot. Germans own the far bank, and they're not going to let us take it easy. But we've done hard things before. We took Omaha Beach. We fought through the hedgerows. We closed Falaise. We can do this." The words sounded hollow even to him. But what else could he say? Tell them the truth, that many of them would die in the next 24 hours. That he was sending them into a meat grinder with inadequate support and no realistic hope of low casualties. They already knew these things. They'd known them since D-Day. "Get some rest," James continued. "Check your weapons and equipment. Write letters home if you want. Mail goes out at midnight. And He paused, searching for something meaningful to say, something that would give them courage or comfort. But there was nothing, just the cold reality of war and death and duty. "And I'm proud to serve with you," he finished. "Every one of you. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that." They dispersed to their positions, and James was left standing in the rain, wondering if those words had meant anything, or if they were just more comfortable lies to help men face death. Bull Daniels appeared beside him, materializing out of the darkness like a ghost. "Hell of a speech, Lieutenant. Shut up, Bull." They stood together in silence, listening to the rain and the distant rumble of artillery. Across the river, German positions were invisible in the darkness, but James knew they were there, waiting. "You remember what I said back in that village?" Daniels asked, "about wondering if we're heroes or just necessary." "Yeah, I figured it out," Daniels said. "We're neither. We're just men doing a job that needs doing. There's nothing heroic about it. It's just math and bullets and dumb luck. Some of us live, some of us die, and the only difference is chance." "That's a hell of a philosophy, Bull." "It's the only one that makes sense," Daniels replied. "All that stuff about courage and sacrifice and noble causes, that's for the folks back home, for the people who need to believe we're something special, but we're not. We're just ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, trying to survive until we can go home." James thought about that. "Then why do you keep fighting? If it's all just chance and math, why not quit? Take a wound that'll get you evacuated, sit out the rest of the war in a hospital somewhere." Daniels smiled grimly. "Because quitting would mean those 14 kids in our platoon have to do it without me, and I'm too damn stubborn to let that happen." He clapped James on the shoulder. "Same as you, Lieutenant. We keep going because somebody has to, and we're too ornery to stop." They returned to the command post, a shell crater covered with a tarp, and tried to sleep. James lay in the mud, listening to the rain, thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. If he survived the river crossing, there would be Metz to fight through, then deeper into Germany, then who knew what else. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was showing no signs of ending, and every day brought new objectives, new battles, new casualties. He thought about Michael O'Brien and his Margaret, about Private Edwards from Texas, about the hundreds of men he'd watched die over the past 4 months. Would anyone remember them? Would there be monuments and memorials, or would they be forgotten? Just names on casualty lists filed away in some government archive. And what about the survivors? What about him and Bull Daniels and the handful of others who'd made it this far? Would they ever be able to live normal lives again? Or were they broken beyond repair, damaged goods who would spend the rest of their days haunted by what they'd seen and done? There were no answers. Just rain and darkness and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more death, more horror, more mathematics of infantry combat adding up to numbers that would destroy families back home. James finally fell into a fitful sleep, plagued by nightmares. He dreamed of drowning in the Moselle, of Michael O'Brien pulling him down into bloody water, of German machine guns that never ran out of ammunition. He woke before dawn, covered in cold sweat, his heart hammering. The rain had stopped. That was something, at least. At 0445 hours, James's platoon gathered at the riverbank where the assault boats had been positioned, 12-foot plywood crafts that looked like they'd sink if you breathed on them wrong. Each boat would carry 8 men plus 2 engineers to paddle. James's 14 men would need 2 boats, and he'd have to split them, hoping both groups made it across. He divided them as fairly as he could. Bull Daniels would take 7 men in one boat, while James led 6 in the other. They synchronized watches, checked weapons one last time, and climbed into the boats. At exactly 0500 hours, American artillery opened up, pounding the far bank with everything they had. For 2 minutes, shells screamed overhead and exploded across the river. Then silence. "Go! Go! Go!" The engineers pushed off and began paddling furiously. The current was stronger than expected, immediately pushing them downstream from their intended landing point. James could see Daniel's boat about 20 yards to his left, the sergeant's face grim as he gripped his bar. They were halfway across when the German machine guns opened fire. The water around them erupted with impacts as bullets tore through the surface. One of the engineers in James's boat took a round through the head and slumped over his paddle. Another soldier, Private Henderson, a kid from Iowa, was shot through the chest and fell backward into the water, disappearing beneath the surface before anyone could grab him. "Keep paddling!" James roared. "Don't stop!" The remaining engineer paddled like his life depended on it, which it did. James and his men returned fire at the German positions, not really aiming, just trying to put bullets downrange. The boat lurched as more rounds hit it, punching holes through the thin plywood. Water began seeping in. James looked left and saw Daniel's boat take a direct hit from what must have been a 20mm cannon. The craft disintegrated in an explosion of wood and bodies. Men were thrown into the water, most of them sinking immediately under the weight of their equipment. James saw Bull Daniel's surface, swimming hard for the far bank, but couldn't tell if any of the others had survived. His own boat ground against the shore. Not where they'd planned to land, but at least they'd made it. James vaulted over the side into knee-deep water and charged toward the bank, his remaining men following. Bullets kicked up water and sand around them. Private Morrison took a round through the leg and went down, screaming. James dragged Morrison to cover behind a fallen tree on the riverbank, then looked back at what remained of his platoon. 6 men had been in his boat. 2 were dead, 1 wounded, 3 effectives, including himself. He couldn't see Daniels or any of the men from the other boat. All around him, other boats were landing or being destroyed. The river was full of bodies and debris. Some men made it to shore, many didn't. The Germans had perfect fields of fire and were using them to devastating effect. This was Omaha Beach all over again, just with a river instead of sand. "Morrison!" James shouted at the wounded private. "Can you fight?" The kid nodded through gritted teeth. "Yes, sir." "Then get on that bar and start putting fire on those German positions." James pointed at a farmhouse about 50 yards inland where heavy machine gun fire was coming from. "We're going to take that house or die trying." It was suicide. James knew it was suicide. 3 men, 2.5 really, given Morrison's wound, against a fortified German position. But staying pinned on the riverbank was death too, just slower. At least attacking gave them a chance. He gathered the 2 unwounded men, Corporal Williams and Private Chen, and explained the plan. Or rather, the lack of plan. Run at the farmhouse shooting, hope the Germans missed, throw grenades through the windows, clear the building. Simple, brutal, probably fatal. "On 3, James said. 1, 2, 3. They burst from cover and sprinted toward the farmhouse. Morrison's bar chattered behind them, laying down covering fire that forced the Germans to duck. James ran in a crouch, firing his carbine, seeing his round spark off the building's stone walls. 20 yards. 10 yards. A German soldier appeared in a window with a Panzerfaust, an anti-tank weapon that would vaporize them if it hit. James shot him twice, and the German fell back. Corporal Williams threw a grenade through the window, and the explosion blew out the shutters. They hit the door together, Chen kicking it in while James and Williams charged through. The interior was smoke and chaos, dead Germans from the grenade, living Germans scrambling for weapons. James shot one, then another. Williams bayoneted a third who came at them with a knife, and then it was over. The farmhouse was clear. 7 Germans lay dead, and the machine gun that had been commanding the riverbank was silent. James stumbled to a window and looked out at the river. More assault boats were making it across now that this position had been silenced. American troops were establishing a beachhead, pushing inland. Medics were working on wounded men scattered across the bank. And then he saw him, Bull Daniels, soaking wet, limping badly, but alive. The sergeant had made it to shore downstream and fought his way back to James's position. 3 other men from his boat had survived, 3 out of 8. "Hell of a swim, Lieutenant," Daniels gasped as he stumbled into the farmhouse. "Next time, let's take a bridge, yeah?" James laughed, actually laughed, despite everything. They'd made it, against all odds, through fire and death, and the mathematics of combat that said they should all be corpses in the river. They'd made it. His platoon was down to 9 men now from the 14 who'd started the crossing, but they were across. They'd taken a key position. American forces were pouring over the river behind them. The bridgehead was established. Lieutenant Colonel Miller arrived 3 hours later, leading the battalion headquarters element across one of the pontoon bridges the engineers had thrown up. He found James in the farmhouse, organizing a defensive perimeter with what remained of his platoon. "Good work, Harrison," Miller said, surveying the German bodies. "This position was the key to the whole crossing. You probably saved 50 lives by taking it out." James nodded numbly. He'd heard variations of that speech before, after the bunker on D-Day, after the crossroads near St. Lo, after a dozen other fights. Always good work, always saved lives. Never mind the lives it cost to achieve it. "Sir," James said, "my platoon needs replacements. We're down to 9 men. We can't continue combat operations at this strength." "I know," Miller replied, "and you'll get them. There's a batch of replacements coming up from the rear. Should be here by tonight. You'll get enough to bring your platoon back to 30 men. 30 men who would die just as quickly as the others had. 30 new faces to remember, 30 new ghosts to haunt his dreams. But what choice did they have? The war wasn't over. Germany wasn't defeated. The job wasn't done. "Yes, sir," James said. That night, as promised, replacements arrived. 21 fresh-faced kids straight from training camps, none of them older than 20, all of them eager and terrified and completely unprepared for what awaited them. James gathered them together and gave them the speech he'd given to every batch of replacements, the speech about staying low and moving fast and not bunching up. But he looked at their young faces and saw Michael O'Brien, saw Private Edwards, saw Private Henderson, who died in the river just that morning. He saw all the men he'd failed to bring home, all the lives that had ended under his command. "Welcome to the platoon," he finished. "Try to stay alive." It was the most honest thing he could say. December 1944 found Lieutenant James Harrison and his platoon dug into frozen foxholes in the Hurtgen forest, a nightmarish tangle of trees and mud southeast of Aachen. They'd been fighting here for 6 weeks, advancing sometimes 100 yards a day, sometimes just 50, paying for every meter with blood. The Hurtgen was different from anything they'd faced before. The forest was so dense that artillery airbursts detonated in the treetops, raining hot shrapnel down on anyone below. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. German positions were everywhere and nowhere, hidden in the trees, in the mud, in cunningly camouflaged bunkers that could only be found by stumbling onto them. James's platoon had cycled through 4 complete sets of replacements since crossing the Moselle. Of the 9 men who'd survived that river crossing in September, only 3 remained. Bull Daniels, now a scarred veteran who refused evacuation despite a growing collection of wounds. Corporal Williams, promoted after showing exceptional leadership in a dozen firefights. And Private Chen, the quiet soldier who seemed to bear a charmed life. The forest was killing them slowly. Not through big battles or dramatic assaults, but through constant attrition. A sniper here, a mortar there. A booby trap along a forest trail. Men died 1 or 2 at a time, and were replaced, and the replacements died, and the cycle continued endlessly. James had stopped learning their names. It was easier that way. When a replacement died after 3 days, it hurt less if you'd never bothered to learn who he was. Bull Daniels had called him out on it once, said he was becoming cold, losing his humanity. James had agreed. What else could he do? Caring about every man who died would drive him insane. On the morning of December 16th, James was huddled in his foxhole with Williams, trying to stay warm as snow fell through the bare trees above them. They'd been promised a break, rotation out of the line for Christmas, hot food, showers, mail from home. Just a few more days of holding their position, then relief. German artillery started at 5:30 hours. It wasn't the usual harassing fire they'd grown accustomed to. This was different, concentrated, sustained, overwhelming. Shells fell like rain, exploding in the treetops, tearing through the forest. Men screamed as shrapnel found them. Trees shattered, sending splinters as deadly as bullets through the air. James huddled at the bottom of his foxhole, hands over his head, as the world exploded around him. This was worse than Omaha Beach, worse than the Moselle crossing, worse than anything he'd experienced. The bombardment went on and on, 30 minutes, an hour, longer. Trees fell across foxholes, burying men alive. Direct hits obliterated positions. The forest itself seemed to be dying. When the shelling finally stopped, James's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear. He climbed out of his foxhole to assess damage and found a scene of utter devastation. His platoon's position had been torn apart. Bodies, or pieces of bodies, lay everywhere. Wounded men were crying for medics. The forest looked like it had been hit by a hurricane. "Report!" James shouted, though his own voice sounded muffled and distant. Squad leaders began calling in. First squad, 6 men, down to 3. Second squad, wiped out entirely by a direct hit. Third squad, 4 survivors. Weapons squad, 2 men left. In minutes, the German artillery had reduced his platoon from 34 men to 15 effectives, and then the German infantry attacked. They came through the forest in company strength, maybe more, professional soldiers moving with practiced efficiency. These weren't the demoralized defenders they'd been facing. These were SS troops, fresh and well-equipped and deadly. The fight that followed was savage and confused. In the dense forest, it was impossible to establish clear lines. Combat dissolved into a series of individual firefights as Americans and Germans stumbled onto each other in the smoke and snow. James killed 3 German soldiers at point-blank range, so close he could see their faces clearly. One of them was just a kid, maybe 16, who cried for his mother as he died. Bull Daniels appeared from the smoke, his uniform torn and bloody, firing his bar from the hip. "They're everywhere, Lieutenant. We gotta fall back or they'll overrun us." James knew he was right, but they'd been ordered to hold this position. Falling back without orders could mean a court-martial, but staying meant dying. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Pull back," James ordered. "Fighting withdrawal. Get to the fallback position." His men, what remained of them, began moving back through the forest, firing as they went, trying to maintain some semblance of order. James stayed at the rear with Daniels and Williams, covering the retreat, shooting Germans who pressed too close. Private Chen went down, shot through both legs. Williams and another soldier dragged him along, refusing to leave him despite Chen's screams to be abandoned. That was something, James thought. Even after all the death, all the horror, his men still wouldn't leave each other behind. They fought their way back half a mile to the battalion's secondary position, losing men the entire way. By the time they stumbled into friendly lines, James's platoon numbered 8 effectives and 4 wounded. 26 casualties in less than 2 hours. 10. Lieutenant Colonel Miller was at the command post, coordinating the defense. His face was grey, aged by stress and responsibility. "Harrison, what's your status?" 8 men, sir, plus 4 wounded. The Germans hit us hard. SS troops, company strength or more. They overran our position." "I know," Miller said grimly. "They're hitting the whole line. This isn't a local attack, it's a major offensive. Intelligence is calling it the Battle of the Bulge. Germans are pushing into Belgium, trying to split our forces and reach Antwerp." The Bulge. James would later learn this was Hitler's last desperate gamble. Throw everything at the Allies, achieve a breakthrough, maybe force a negotiated peace. It was insane, impossible, doomed to fail. But in that moment, with German forces pushing forward and American lines crumbling, it felt like the war might be starting over. For the next month, James and his men fought a desperate defensive battle. The initial shock of the German offensive gave way to stubborn resistance. As American forces rallied, the Germans pushed forward, then were stopped, then were pushed back. The fighting was brutal, house to house in Belgian villages, foxhole to foxhole in frozen forests, tank battles on snow-covered roads. James's platoon ceased to exist as a coherent unit. He was given command of stragglers from 3 different companies, a ragtag collection of men who'd survived the initial German assault and been thrown together into an ad hoc fighting force. He led them because someone had to, because they needed leadership, because that's what he did. Bull Daniels was wounded on December 23rd, finally, inevitably. A German mortar fragment caught him in the side, a serious wound that should have killed him but somehow didn't. The medics evacuated him, and James watched the ambulance drive away, carrying the last link to his original platoon from D-Day. He felt nothing, no grief, no loss, just a vague recognition that something had ended. On Christmas Day, James's makeshift platoon was dug in outside the Belgian town of Bastogne, which had become the focal point of the German offensive. American forces there were surrounded, holding on by their fingernails, and relief columns were fighting to break through. Some rear echelon officer had arranged for hot food to be brought up, turkey and mashed potatoes, a Christmas dinner in the middle of a war. James sat in his foxhole eating mechanically, tasting nothing, feeling nothing. Around him, his men tried to celebrate, singing Christmas carols quietly, sharing photographs from home. Private Morrison, different Morrison than the one who'd been wounded at the Moselle, James had lost track of how many Morrisons had passed through his command, was showing pictures of his little sister back in Oregon. "She's 8, Morrison said proudly. "Smart as a whip. Gonna be a doctor someday." James looked at the photograph. A gap-toothed girl in a Sunday dress, grinning at the camera. He thought about Michael O'Brien and his Margaret, about Private Edwards from Texas, about the hundreds of others who'd had sisters and daughters and futures that had been cut short by German bullets. "She's beautiful," James said, "because that's what you said." Then he went back to eating his turkey, which tasted like sawdust. The relief of Bastogne came on December 26th. Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement, and the tide turned. The Bulge began to collapse. By mid-January, the Germans were in full retreat, having lost thousands of men and massive amounts of equipment they could not replace. James's unit, he couldn't even remember what it was called now, some composite battalion thrown together from the wreckage of the offensive, pursued the Germans back toward the German border. They liberated villages the Germans had captured just weeks before. They counted frozen German corpses and destroyed tanks, and felt no satisfaction, just exhaustion. In late January, they reached the Siegfried Line, Germany's final defensive barrier before the Rhine River. The fortifications were formidable. Concrete bunkers, minefields, tank traps, all designed to make an attack as costly as possible. Intelligence estimated it would take months to break through, but the Germans were broken now, exhausted by the failed Bulge offensive, running out of men and equipment and will. When the American assault came on February 1st, resistance was fierce but localized. Some positions fought to the death, others surrendered after token resistance. The line that was supposed to be impregnable fell in 3 weeks. James led his men through the Siegfried Line without feeling any sense of achievement. They were in Germany now, the enemy's homeland, but it didn't matter. Every town looked the same. Every fight cost the same price in blood. The war had become mechanical, routine, devoid of meaning beyond the simple mathematics of objectives taken and casualties suffered. On March 7th, American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, a miraculous stroke of luck that allowed them to cross the Rhine without the massive casualties a river assault would have cost. James's unit crossed on March 10th, part of the flood of American troops pouring into Germany's heartland. The end was close now. Everyone knew it. German resistance was collapsing. Towns surrendered without fighting. Soldiers gave up by the thousands. But the dying continued. Snipers still shot, fanatics still fought, and American boys still fell. James had stopped thinking about survival. He'd been fighting for 10 months now since D-Day, and he'd long since used up his statistical likelihood of living through the war. Every day he woke up alive felt like borrowed time. He led his men mechanically, gave orders mechanically, killed mechanically. The man who'd landed on Omaha Beach, nervous, scared, still believing in heroism and glory, was dead. What remained was a hollow shell that did its duty because it didn't know how to do anything else. On April 12, 1945, word came that President Roosevelt had died. James heard the news and felt nothing. Men around him wept or stood in shocked silence. He just nodded and went back to cleaning his carbine. Death was too common to be remarkable anymore, even when it was the president. 3 weeks later, on May 4th, James's unit reached a town in Bavaria whose name he never learned. German soldiers were surrendering en masse, throwing down their weapons, raising their hands. The war in Europe was effectively over, though the formal surrender wouldn't come for another 4 days. Lieutenant Colonel Miller, now full colonel, gathered his surviving officers in the town square. There were maybe 20 of them, all that remained from the hundreds who'd landed at Normandy 11 months before. They looked like ghosts, these young men who'd aged decades in less than a year. "Gentlemen," Miller said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion, "we've done it. Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over." The officers stood in silence. No cheering, no celebration. Just silence and the weight of everything they'd endured and everyone they'd lost. "I know what this cost," Miller continued. "I know what you've sacrificed. I know about the men we left behind on beaches and in forests and in anonymous towns across Europe. They're heroes, every one of them, and so are you, the ones who survived, who kept fighting, who finished the job." His voice broke slightly. "You did the impossible. You defeated evil. You freed a continent. You can be proud of that for the rest of your lives." James listened to the words and wanted to feel something. Pride, satisfaction, relief, anything. But there was just emptiness. They'd won, but the victory felt hollow. Too many men had died. Too much blood had been spilled. And for what? So the survivors could go home carrying trauma that would never heal, memories that would never fade. That night, as his men celebrated, drinking German beer they'd liberated, singing songs, embracing each other, James sat alone on the steps of a destroyed church and stared at nothing. The war was over. He'd survived. Against all odds, against all probability, he was alive. But what did that mean? What came next? How was he supposed to go back to Nebraska, back to the farm, back to a life that seemed like it belonged to someone else? How was he supposed to live with the things he'd done, the men he'd killed, the friends he'd failed to save? He thought of Michael O'Brien, dead in the water at Omaha Beach. Private Edwards, killed before he could take 3 steps. Bull Daniels, wounded and evacuated, probably back in the States by now. All the others, hundreds of faces, most of them nameless, all of them dead. "Lieutenant?" It was Corporal Williams, one of the few men who'd survived from the Moselle crossing back in September. "You okay, sir?" James looked up at him. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "None of us are fine, Williams. We just pretend." James stood up, his joints aching. He was 24 years old and moved like an old man. "But we're alive. That's something, I guess." "It's everything, sir," Williams said quietly. "The men we lost, they'd want us to live, to go home, have families, be happy, to make their sacrifice mean something." Would they? James wasn't sure. But Williams needed to believe it, and James didn't have the heart to take that away from him. "You're right," James said. "We owe them that much." The next week was a blur of administrative processing and waiting. James filled out forms, wrote reports, attended debriefings. The army was beginning the massive task of sending millions of men home, and the bureaucracy ground slowly. On May 15th, James received orders assigning him to occupation duty in Berlin. He would spend the next 6 months helping rebuild Germany, processing displaced persons, overseeing the arrest of Nazi officials. Part of him wanted to refuse, to demand immediate transport home, but another part, the part that had been forged in combat, knew that refusing wasn't an option. The job wasn't done. It wouldn't be done for months, maybe years. So Lieutenant James Harrison, survivor of Omaha Beach, the Hurtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, and 100 other engagements, accepted his orders and prepared for the next phase of a war that was officially over, but would never truly end. Not for him, not for any of the men who'd fought it. He sat down that evening and wrote a letter to his parents in Nebraska, the first honest one he'd written in 11 months. "Dear Mom and Dad, the war is over. I'm alive. I'll be coming home eventually, though I don't know when. I want to tell you that I'm the same person who left Nebraska 2 years ago, but I'd be lying. The war changed me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I've seen and done things I can never tell you about, things that will stay with me for the rest of my life. I'm not sure how to be your son anymore. I'm not sure how to be anyone except a soldier, but I'm going to try. When I come home, I'm going to try to be the person you remember, even if that person doesn't really exist anymore. I love you both. Tell everyone I'm okay, even though I'm not sure what okay means anymore. A son, James." He sealed the letter and gave it to the mail clerk, then walked out into the German night and looked up at the stars. The same stars that shone over Nebraska, over Omaha Beach, over all the battlefields where American boys had fought and died for reasons that seemed simultaneously crystal clear and utterly incomprehensible. The war was over, but the weight of it would never lift. That was the price of victory, the burden carried by those who survived. They would go home, rebuild their lives, start families, pursue careers, but part of them would always remain in France, in Belgium, in Germany, frozen in moments of terror and courage and death that defined them in ways nothing else ever would. But Lieutenant James Harrison stood under those stars and made a silent promise to Michael O'Brien and Private Edwards and Bull Daniels and all the others, living and dead, who'd made the journey with him. He would live. He would go home. He would make their sacrifice mean something, even if he didn't know how. That was all any of them could do.